This is a Geek Leader podcast, and I'm your host, John Rauda. This show is all about helping us grow as leaders, become better technologists, and improve our lives both at work and at home. I hope you enjoy the show and learn a lot. Welcome to a Geek Leader podcast. I'm your host, John Rauda. And if you could, please do me a favor and take a moment and leave a rating and review in whatever podcast player you're listening to this on, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, doesn't matter. I would greatly appreciate it. And that feedback really helps get other listeners to the show. Also, if you're not subscribed, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And if you feel so inclined, you can go to geekleader.com/tip and donate to the show. Thanks so much. All right, Geek Leaders, today I'm honored to have Rob Rob Kalwarowsky on the show, and he is a speaker, TEDx speaker, former engineer, or maybe still an engineer doing engineering work from MIT, which is pretty awesome. And now he is the co-host of the Leadership Launchpad podcast, and he also does leadership coaching and consulting. So with all that being said, Rob, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, John. No, I've put the engineering behind me. It was funny, actually. A few weeks ago, a former industry friend of mine, he reached out. He was like, I'd love to have you look at this plan I have for some asset management stuff. And I was like, sorry, I'm not doing that anymore.
Yeah, I get that all the time. People ask me, hey, can you look at this app that I'm building? I'm like, no, I really can't. I haven't done that in years. So, tell me about what you're into now and kind of how you got there in your career. What was your journey like, and what made you decide that talking about leadership and helping people in that aspect is important to you?
Yeah, it's something I'm super passionate about, and as you mentioned, I went to MIT. I played water polo there. I was a former Canadian junior national team member as well, and I learned my whole life, hey, perform and people like you and people, accept you and all these things, right? And it's then I got into the working world. In my first job, I was in mining, coal mining, actually, in BC. And I saved the company. It was around $30 million in the first year I was working there.
Wow.
And actually, it caused a lot of rift, right? And even from someone where you're going well, when I get A's in the classroom, that's good. When I score goals in the pool, that's good. And now I'm doing what you said you wanted me to do in the job, but it's not good. And it was partly because my boss was very this passive aggressive, but there was this attitude of we've always done it this way. And then what I see now as sort of the informed leadership coach that I didn't know at the time was he would have done anything to look good in front of his boss, but also to avoid looking bad. And for him, having someone come in who was pretty brand new, but save all that money by changing the things he set up, this was very disruptive. So fast forward a few years, basically not long after, I started getting depressed because I kept feeling like the work I was doing and the person who I was being rejected at work. And then in 2013, I had a suicide attempt that sort of stemmed out of all of that because I started losing, who am I if I'm not good at my job? I don't have anything else going on. I struggled to figure out who I was, which is a slippery slope.
Is part of that mainly because you had your identity wrapped up into your job?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so I think this is something, I see this with folks that I coach all the time. And it's not just the super powered executive, right? It's like I was an entry-level engineer and I had this problem. And this is what I see with folks now is they're known as the hero at work, or they're known as the person who's there if they get a call on a Saturday. Or, they work for, I work with some companies that they have teams that are all the way from India to San Francisco. And it's that person can literally work 24 hours a day and have somebody on their team online. And so they're known for this person who's always there when you need them. And that can be hugely taxing on the person if they're working that many hours, but also it's just like, this is part of their identity. And yeah, through the, I guess, fast forward, I've done a massive amount of healing work, as well as a massive amount of leadership development. And where I wanted to lead folks is I don't want anyone to experience what I experienced with a bad boss, and also just having themselves be defined by the job that they have.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a lot of the work I do today, is even turning leaders into higher performing leaders or individual contributors. Like, it doesn't matter, but like learning about who you are and ultimately who do you want to become, and giving that purpose and meaning is the switch that many of us never learn. Like, I never learned this stuff in school.
Oh yeah. You definitely don't learn this stuff in school. And I had one of those that's part of the reason why I had this podcast is I had a really, really bad boss, and I became a manager, and I kind of did what I knew from what other bosses did, right? So I wasn't a very good boss either, and then I started I had a good mentor that I did get paired up with a very good mentor that kind of gave me the brutal truth that I'm the problem. I need to fix this stuff, and going through examples of how to learn things, I thought I don't want my children to ever have to get a boss like what I had. So what can I do to try to shape the future leaders that are out there that are coming up, and especially in the tech space, because that's what I know, what I'm known for, what I know about. So if I can get good leaders in the tech space, then maybe my kids will have good bosses someday. Yeah, you never know. But hey, it's a step in the right direction.
Oh, I totally resonate with this, right?
Mm.
My entire career, I wouldn't say they were like, when I talk about asshole bosses, and it's really just, to poke the bear a little bit. But when we think of like a classic asshole boss, right, we're thinking of like, the example I always use is like Gordon Ramsay on Hell's Kitchen. I know he's bunny hole, but it's like Hell's Kitchen, Gordon Ramsay, he throws the plate on the ground, you donkey, whatever, right? And it's like, actually, that's not a huge percentage of what toxic leaders look like.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's very small. There's actually, according to the research that I use about destructive leadership, there's about 6 different types. There's 6 different types of quote unquote destructive leaders. And that can range from that Gordon Ramsay, which is called the arrogant and violent boss, all the way to just folks that, they're messy, or they don't give clear specifications and clarifications to their people. I struggle with this sometimes. Or like and this, you might see this a lot in your career, John. I saw this a ton in my engineering career, was folks who didn't want to take accountability.
Oh yeah.
So you go to the manager and then they would just go, yeah, that's upper management's decision. Or I don't want to micromanage, you figure it out. And like, that's called a cowardly boss or a ghost manager, but that's another destructive leadership type that's not like actively out to get you. It's just like, hey, maybe you have some mindset stuff going on, or the company's set up in a way where, taking accountability is bad. It's not a good idea for my long-term career prospects. So I'm going to defer that. And then if it works out, I'm going to take credit. And if it doesn't work out, well, then it was your fault.
Yeah, you get those bosses that not only do they not take accountability, but they don't hold other people accountable either. And then it gets even worse, down the chain, in my opinion. And I remember, I think it was Daniel Pink that said one time in one of his talks that, everybody hates a boss that yells at them, but more than that, they hate a boss that ignores them. They would rather be yelled at than ignored completely.
Yeah. The foundation, I think, here is having a caring manager, right? And having trust, which in the Charles Feltman's book, The Thin Book of Trust, one of the elements of trust is care. And so it's care, reliability, sincerity, and competence. And the core elements, actually, it's not like what Rob judges Rob on those 4 categories. It's actually what John judges Rob on those categories, whether we have trust or not. So I can care about you, but unless you feel that I care about you, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, it's kind of like that saying that perception is reality.
Yeah, that's absolutely true, right? And so, like we see this in sports, like Tom Brady and Bill Belichick used to yell at each other on the sidelines, but it came from a place of high trust. I care about you, you care about me, and we're both out to win the game and win the Super Bowl. Like there was no discussion what the goal was. It was always we're winning. We're trying to win. And so you can yell at each other, and then like on Monday they'd walk into the office and the relationship was the same. And that's the thing, right? Is like, it's always about like the perception of the behavior, but also like, what's the foundation that you have built up?
So how do we go about building those foundations? If we are a new leader, a new boss, or maybe we find ourselves as being one of those bosses that kind of pushes accountability up and we're starting to realize like, I need to really take hold of this stuff. How do we go about building those foundations?
Totally. So if you're one of the bosses that pushes accountability up or even pushes accountability down, just avoids it, this is a mindset problem. So typically now you got to work with somebody, a coach, a therapist, even someone like a friend at work who really understands you, but start to uncover why you're unwilling to accept responsibility. And this could mean, like, a lot of folks have this imposter syndrome. So I'm sure you've seen this a lot, John, is like someone gets promoted and they're not the oldest or they're not the most expert or they're not the whatever. And now they're the leader and they're like, how can I manage someone who's got 25 years experience in this very, super expert in this field? How can I manage them? Who am I to do that? Right? And that's when that sort of plays out one way, where they avoid it. The other way it could play out is they super micromanage that person to prove how smart and intelligent they are.
Yeah.
Both of those are sort of ego and mindset traps that we can learn our way out of that.
Yeah. So you hit one of those words that I like to, talk about a lot because I see it a lot in the tech and engineering field is the ego. And it happens all the time. And I suffered from it quite a bit when I first became a manager. I didn't realize that's what it was. But I had the idea of, I like to micromanage. I wanted to make sure everybody was writing code the way that I would write the code. And, I had to do code reviews, but they weren't really just to review the code. It was to see like, why are you doing it the dumb way? Why don't you do it the smart person's way? It all became my ego. And, luckily I had someone that looked at me one day and just said, look, you don't scale. You're trying to do code reviews and work through 6 people's code, and you're the bottleneck of everything that you're doing right now. And, you have 6 people that should be putting, 6 people's worth of code out there, and they're only getting 1 because you're the one slowing everybody down. So he's like, even if they're only writing, 50% as good as you, that's still 3 times what you could do by yourself. So you need to like back out and get away from that. And that's when I realized that ego was really a problem that I was struggling with. How often do you see that in the management, engineering, leadership kind of, where people are taking those new leadership roles and their egos are getting in the way?
So I'll give you a slightly different answer to this. I don't want to use the word ego. I actually coach folks using the word, the system, the modality around internal family systems. And it basically breaks those parts. They call them parts, but you can almost think of it like the movie Inside Out, where there was this little dudes inside the girl's mind and they were at the control panel. And basically those parts, some of them are designed to protect you. And that was what was going on with you, John, is there's somewhere in your childhood where you were hurt about not being perfect or not being good enough or not being accepted or not being loved or not being whatever the thing is. And then you developed a part that said, hey, if I'm in charge, if I'm performing in perfection, then I won't feel pain about whatever the hurt thing was. And so literally everybody in the world has these things. So it's not new leaders. It's not individual contributors. It's not like, it's everybody. Now, of course, they vary in terms of strength and what they do, but that's the reason for either, literally I had a client, I think it was yesterday or the day before, said exactly the same thing to me as you just said, right? So this is a common experience. The other side of it is like they'll drive behaviors like overworking, people pleasing, hypervigilance, like this obsession of like everything has to be right in their house or like at work. Hyperlogical, so the folks who sort of dissociate from the emotions and just look at like purely logistical side. And then even stuff like, when we're hurting, it's been a long day, we go home, we eat some ice cream or we eat a pizza, right? Mm-hmm. That can also be a protection where it's like we feel bad, so we go on Amazon and we buy something or we eat a pizza, to all the way to real extreme stuff like suicide and addiction. Mm-hmm. But we all have that. And so it's learning to understand which ones are the ones that show up. And this is the self-awareness piece, but learning which ones of those show up for me. And then how do I work with them to sort of allow them to release, so then I can show up me as me, not as these parts that want to do certain things.
Yeah, that makes sense. And, I think a lot of times you get into that trap of this doesn't feel comfortable, like I didn't feel comfortable with other people's code because it wasn't mine, and how do I, it goes back to trust, I guess. How do I trust them to be putting, something that my name's going to be on out there?
Yeah. So that's the other side, right? Mm-hmm. And this is where ultimately the goal of internal family systems is to release all those protection mechanisms so you can show up as you. Mm. Now, when I talk about this, I say it's like, imagine you're a football team and you only put the defense out on the field, even when you have the ball, right? You're never going to win. But if you learn, and that's what those protectors are, you can think of them as like cornerbacks and defensive ends. And so they're great at playing defense, but just like Tom Brady said, like I couldn't even play high school at any other position other than quarterback, right? But it's like they're very specialized at doing these things. But once they're allowed to release, I can go full offense at all times, full growth. And I don't have to worry about, well, there was a mistake in the code. It's just sort of like, there was a mistake in the code. Okay, does this mean that this person's not good for the role, or they need more training, or they need somebody else to make sure that that's okay, like whatever the checks and balances are? But you can look at it very much like enter that continuous improvement cycle versus like, oh, this is an attack on me and now I gotta yell at them or they made a mistake, so next time I have to go line by line by line, so then I prevent that happening again.
Right. Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. It is very, very, when you're an individual contributor and you're just writing code, you have just one position to play. And then when you become like a leader, now you're the coach and you have to make decisions about which person's going to play that role.
It's hard, right? Like becoming a leader is incredibly hard. And like, that's the part where you and I as leadership coaches, right? It's like, this is why that is important. And I'm sure you've heard the stat, but I was in Harvard Business Review, and it was the average person becomes a supervisor at 29 years old, and then they receive leadership training at 42.
That sounds about right.
Like, we don't let anyone in the world do a job with no training. like people at fast food restaurants get trained on how to make a burger, run the fry station. Like, hairdressers have to do this long thing where they learn an apprenticeship. Like, and now we're just going, John, you're good at coding. Like, you want to lead a team of coders now?
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
What are you doing?
Yeah. It was a year after I got promoted to my first management position that our company did they called it leadership training, but it wasn't training. It was just like let's check a checkbox and have some people come out and talk to you. But the one good thing that did come out of that is I did get assigned a mentor, and that really like changed my, perspective, because I got someone that's not in tech, not at all, in the fields that I'm associated with. He was actually in sales. It's completely different than anything that I'd, been a part of. And he had been around for a while. He had managed people for a long time and was very candid and was able to tell me what I needed to hear, when I needed to hear it. And, it's like, oh, okay, I didn't realize that, lots of light bulbs popping off in my head. I'm like, okay, I need to get my head wrapped around this thing. And, I guess you're right. You look at it, most managers and people, if they want to become good leaders, it's on themselves to really go out there and find that training, because companies, for the most part, aren't giving it to them.
And the training they give them is ineffective. That's the other side of that stack is only 25% of the leadership training out of, I believe it's 356 billion is the number that HBS uses, because it addresses mindset. Mm-hmm. And the rest of it doesn't. And that's what you notice, and this is where I talk a lot about leaders need to have mirrors of truth. And that's a mentor, that's a friend, your therapist, your coach, like you and I, even like a colleague. Like, doesn't matter, they have to be trusted, they have to be able to give you that back. But it's like, if you don't have that as a leader, you're dead in the water.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I was talking to a Navy SEAL on the show named John Havlick, and he mentioned, the way he put it is, he said, every CEO or commanding officer has to have a master chief. You got to have that one guy that will just frankly tell you that you're making a mistake and that you're in the wrong, and you need to listen to your people underneath you. You can't just give commands and commands and commands. You have to have that one person that says, hold on a second, and bring you back down to earth and point you in the right direction. If you don't have that person on your team, you need to find them. And that's one of the things that I've learned, especially where I'm at now. I've got to have that person that I trust completely, and that I can be, going off on one of my tangents and just out in the world saying, this is how we do things, this is the strategy when you go, and they just say, no, you're wrong. Like, and here's why you're wrong. And just, okay, let me take a step back. You're right. I went way over my skis here. Let me take a step back and try to figure this out. And having that person on your team is crucial for you to make the right decisions as a leader. And also understanding you can't do it alone. And I think it's where a lot of times leaders have that insecurity to where they think they have to do it alone.
Yeah. And that's part of just, like, again, it's one of those protection defensive mechanisms, right? Is like, and the other side of it, right, is like, because we're not training leaders, mm-hmm. It's sort of like, imagine you're the quarter, like you're Tom Brady, and then you're the best quarterback, and now they're like, oh, you're coaching the team now. And like, you don't get training for it. You just sort of saw Bill Belichick and how he kind of did things, and you're like, yeah, okay, let me think about it now. There's so many pieces, but it's that, right? It's like, you were very good at writing code, or you're very good at whatever, even if it's sales or IT or marketing or HR. And then they're like, yeah, you're promoted. That's two very different skill sets.
Yeah, absolutely. It really is. It's the difference between writing code and leading people I can't even put them in the same realm.
If only people work like computers, it would be so much easier.
Yeah, if I could program a person, I'm good to go. But they have these things called emotions, and then they have these things called, intuition and feelings. There's a lot of things that go into managing people that aren't in managing systems and code, things like that. One thing that I did want to hear from you about is, I've heard on a YouTube video that you did where you were talking about, you learned about being a bad boss basically from walking your dog. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how your dog taught you a little bit about being a boss.
Yeah, my dog, Wednesday, he's amazing. He's actually a COVID puppy. So we got him in 2021 when I was working at home. My wife was still working. She was working in a senior's home, so she was going in a lot. And I was really struggling with depression. Mm-hmm. And yeah, we bought Winston, and he was life-changing for me. And just like any listener, if you have a dog or if you have kids, they teach you everything you need to know.
I've got both, so.
Right, about leadership. Yeah. And it's small stuff, right? It's like, you start to learn your self-awareness, right? And for me, like when I talk about it on stage, I talk about, this time where he was trying to pull down a tree and I was like getting mad at him. Like I was getting frustrated and I was like, how come you're not listening to me? Like you're focused on this thing, but you're never going to get the branch. It's like literally this huge tree. But even stuff like, here's another one that he's taught me was, I love to watch football, as we've talked about on the show. But I used to, when I watch football, obviously sometimes I yell at the refs.
Who doesn't?
And it was funny because this was part of my just subconscious whatever programming. And then once I got Winston, he would sit next to me or sit in the room. And at the moment I would yell at the ref, he would get up and walk out. And now I started going, oh. And so it's like taught me the self-awareness where it's like, oh yeah, I'm getting frustrated and angry and he's leaving because he doesn't want to feel upset. And so I need to be more aware of my emotions and then get myself under control. And it's so like these small things and and then obviously like you're literally trying to train him to do things. And I'm not saying you can use the same strategies with your people at work, but when we talk about giving feedback to folks, it's like you want to reinforce the behavior, not the outcome. So it's not like, hey, you're so smart, the code was great. It was like, what was the decision process that you used to make this code because it turned out being really good?
Mm-hmm.
And it's got to happen in a timely fashion and often. And that's literally like what they teach you about training a puppy is like, you got to give them treats as soon as they do good things and keep it as a thing that you do a lot until they learn it. And so there's a lot of strategies I've learned about leading from my dog.
Yeah, I can say the same thing about my kids. There's so many strategies I've learned from, and we were going through a parenting session with me and my wife, and one of the things that the coach told us was like, it was a little trick called what's your plan for? So instead of like reprimanding your child because they forgot to do something, just say, what's your plan for getting your room clean? What's your plan for making your lunch today? Just kind of to remind them, like, I haven't forgot that you're supposed to do this thing, and you're telling them that you wanted to think about it. So I take that into work all the time. I tried it one time where somebody I had asked to do this report, multiple times. They weren't doing it. Instead of going and yelling at them, I just walked by and said, hey, what's your plan for getting me that report by the end of the day? And it's like, oh, so it kind of reminded them in a nice way to do that. I'm like, oh, I can take a lot of these things that I'm learning, that I'm using with my kids and use them at work. And so far, they seem to be working pretty well. But you're right about the whole reward thing, about giving feedback quickly and often. A lot of leaders don't do that. And I remember one of my bosses from a long time ago would only give feedback during your annual review. And by that point, and he kept all these notes about it, but by that point, I had tried 15 different things. If I would have known the first one worked and was the right way to do it, I would have kept doing it that way. But I didn't get feedback, so I didn't know. I assumed it didn't work, so I tried something different. It's very frustrating. So yeah, I think that's a really important one.
Yeah, it's weird, right? Like that whole annual review thing is so bizarre. And you're right, like many leaders, they're like, oh yeah, I wrote it down. Or there's like even the growth conversations, like where do you want to go in your career and blah, blah, blah. And I tell my folks now, I'm like, do not do that conversation during any quote unquote HR made review.
Right.
Because if you put it in the system, they're not going to be real with you.
Mm-hmm.
And I coach my leaders to really think and connect with folks and help them get where they want to be, even if it was something completely unrelated to their job. Like we had one woman, she was going to start her own coffee shop, and it was like really important to her, and like she's working in IT right now. And it was like we were working on like, hey, her manager, how do you connect the things that she's working on today and the projects you're going to give her to her developing skills that will make her successful at running this coffee shop. And yeah, I mean, I think one is the expectation that someone's going to work at your company till they're 65. Like, yes, that was fine in the 50 years ago, but today in 2023, that's not real.
Yeah.
But it's also like now the person's engaged in these new projects because they're like, yeah, you know what? Yeah, I do actually have to take into account stakeholders and negotiation and working on a team because that's what running my own business is going to be.
Mm-hmm. I think that's really important. And I like the way you said that. And not only is it going to bring them to be engaged in their current project, but it's also going to show them that you as a leader care about them outside of them just being a resource. And, we've tainted employees in such a way that they're just resources. They're just numbers. They're, just another person to fill a slot on a org chart. When in reality, if we treat them like people, we're going to get a lot more out of them as, employees than we would just a resource.
And that's the thing, right? And this is the part that I really lean in on with a lot of folks is the way management is done right now today is literally killing people.
Mm-hmm.
In the United States, the ways companies manage their people is the 5th leading cause of death, causing 120,000 deaths per year and 5 to 8% of the U.S. healthcare cost. The reason for this, right, is increased stress, overload, burnout, anxiety, depression. It's all those toxic leadership practices.
Mm-hmm.
And even those toxic leadership practices, they increase your people's risk of heart attack and stroke and major disease.
Yep.
And so this is the kind of stuff. And when we go like, oh yeah, we're just laying off 20,000 people, or like the tech industry laid off like a few 100,000. Those folks who got laid off, their increased risk of suicide goes up by like 2 to 3 times. And so it's like, we cannot lead folks the way we are. It's just not, like, it's not serving anybody. And you're right. Folks that are happier, they outperform everybody. High trust companies, they return 2 to 3% more each year over a 26-year period than their peers. The finances are out there, and also the fact that you're killing people should also make you, there's the kind of the both. It's a win-win for everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. And I remember, I think it was Simon Sinek in one of his books, Leaders Eat Last. I think he talked about like the cortisol in your body that's supposed to be there just to get you, for out of danger. It's not supposed to stay in your body, but yet we provide these high stress environments, and people are always worried about, should I say that at work? Should I not say that at work? What am I going to do? And it's causing that, constant, drip of cortisol in their system that's giving them that high stress, which is leading to diabetes and heart disease and all kinds of problems that are killing us. Not only that, they're raising our insurance rates. They're costing us money and making a lower productive employee and killing people. And why aren't we doing anything about it? Like from a business standpoint, when we see that there's so many benefits for reducing the stress at work.
Yeah. The cortisol thing is real. I had a client tell me yesterday, they were like, that Teams chat notification sound, they literally, like, they quit their job, not like, and transferred to something else. But it was like, they were like, I noticed my first week off that not having that sound completely just like, because I was noticing at the end was like, every time it came in, it was like an attack. And yeah, it's crazy. But yeah, I mean, why don't we change? I think the big thing, there's a few things. One is the systems that folks have in place, right? And so we know through the research that mass layoffs actually don't improve company performance, nor do they cut costs in the short term, nor do they increase revenue in the long term. And also they kill people. But the stock market likes it, right? So like when, Facebook or Amazon or whoever cut all these people, the stock went up, right? Even though like I don't know why the investors don't look at these reports, but the research says that actually it doesn't really help. That's a separate problem. The other thing is the folks that rise to the top in these companies, they're all massively traumatized. Now, everybody has trauma. There is nobody in the world who has no trauma at all. And it can range from very small to obviously very high. But the folks that we see in leadership positions today as a whole, and I experienced it. I was highly traumatized. It was what drove my performance. It's what I see in all my clients, folks from, entrepreneurs to Olympic gold medalists, all that stuff, right? But we also see it like in the presidents and the congressmen and women, the Senate, tech leaders, like all these leaders, the reason they worked so hard was to prove something to the world. I'm good enough. I'm worthy. I'm loved. It's the same protection that we talked about with the micromanaging on coding or like this perfectionism stuff. It just blows it up because they had more trauma than you. And that's why they needed to prove to mom or dad or the world that they were this important person. So ultimately, for me, it's if we can heal those folks and allow them to not play defense anymore, that's when they can ultimately change the system, because they won't do it now because the system was very rewarding to those defending parts.
Right. That makes perfect sense, and I totally get that. Just it's one of those tough challenges to try to fix, and I guess you have to do it one by one.
Kind of, yeah. I mean, and that's really the way to do it. Ultimately, it's hard to just sort of like Simon Sinek, great guy, love his content, but a book doesn't change folks.
Right.
It gives you the spark of inspiration that may take you on the transformation journey, but reading that book is not going to do the deeper work that's necessary. And that's the thing is, at Elite, we talk about horizontal work and vertical work. Mm-hmm. Horizontal work is reading those books, listening to this show, watching TED Talks, doing that kind of stuff. Vertical work is the deep introspection and self-awareness and mindset work that you need to do to ultimately become the leader you want to be versus playing the role as what you've learned through, what Simon Sinek said or whoever else said.
Yeah. No, I think that's great. And I think you're right. We it's important to do that horizontal work too, to keep yourself, motivated to go further, but you have to point it inside and really dig deep to do that vertical work. And I think I think they're both crucial for us to become better and stronger leaders.
Totally. Yeah. I'm like, I host a podcast too. Like I'm not bashing horizontal work, because also
right.
Here's the other thing, horizontal work, maybe you read, Radical Candor and now it helps you do feedback, right? Like there's value in that. It's half the puzzle, right?
Right.
And so doing both really sets you up to become a great leader, where if you just did horizontal or if you just did vertical, you're missing a piece.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think you're 100% right. Rob, this has been a great conversation. How can people listen to your show, one, and then connect with you online if they have any questions or want to learn more about what you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, if you're listening to this show, just search Leadership Launchpad Project wherever you're listening to this one and hit subscribe. That's our podcast. We talk, similar to this, we have guests on, we talk mindset, we talk leadership, we get deep in the pocket. We've had some folks with psychedelics and psychology as well. So we do some fun stuff. And to connect with me, LinkedIn's your best bet. So I'm just Rob Kalwarowsky on LinkedIn. I'm sure John will drop it in the podcast notes. And then if you want anything from me, you can head over to howtodealboss.com. It's got a free ebook on how to deal with your bad boss. So if you're one of the 65% of people who experiences a bad boss right now, which Probably you are. You can get a free ebook there and learn about, and then also, the one-on-one coaching and all that stuff's there too. So check it out.
Awesome. And I'll link that up in the show notes too at geekleader.com so people can click on that. Rob, thanks again for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, John. It was fun.
Hope you enjoyed the show. Please go to geekleader.com to learn more about what this guest is up to, click on their links, and connect with them online. I would also greatly appreciate it if you could leave me a rating and review in Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to the show. And make sure you've subscribed if you haven't already. And if you feel so inclined, you can leave me a tip by going to geekleader.com/tip.